Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Well Said podcast. I'm your host, Cedric L Threatt. I always like to say, hello, great people. And why do I call you great? Because somebody's got to be great today, and it might as well be you. As I said, welcome to the Well Said podcast, the podcast for inspiring as well as aspiring authors and speakers. You're going to be hearing from some great authors and speakers during this podcast. And today is my maiden voyage, so to speak. This is the first episode of the Well Said podcast, where I normally would have someone that I'm interviewing, an author or speaker. But today, it's just going to be me. It's just me today because this is my maiden voyage. And people may want to know, well, who is this Cedric Threatt? Who is this well said guy? What are his credentials? What gives him the right to talk about all of these authors and speakers and books and things of that nature? Well, today I'm just going to show you, well, I guess you can call it my credentials or whatever. I'm just going to give you a little history of how I got started and why I want to do this podcast in the first place. But before I do that, I need to remind you to go ahead and hit that like button, the subscribe button, let all your friends know about it. Leave us a review with a chat. Or just tell us what you think about the Well Said podcast because it's going to be nice. I think it's really going to be nice. It's something that's needed. I know there are others out there who may be doing the same thing, but I would like to try to take a unique approach to it and interview some authors and let them tell their story and tell you what's going on in their lives and their careers and how they got started and all of that good stuff. So without further ado, I am going to just tell you a little bit about myself. This all started with me. This is my testimony that I share everywhere I go. It started with me back when I was in seventh grade. My literature teacher, Miss Patrick. Miss Patrick entered me in a poetry reading contest. And I knew absolutely nothing about poetry when I was in the seventh grade, 13-year-old kid. I didn't know anything about poetry, but Miss Patrick saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. She introduced me to poetry and entered me in a poetry reading contest. I read a poem called Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. And I won the poetry reading contest and represented my school in a citywide competition. Then the next year in eighth grade, I read a poem called "O Captain, My Captain" by Walt Whitman. And I think I was the alternate that year. So after that, I continued to read poetry and eventually started writing my own poetry through high school. And after high school, I joined the military. I was in the Air Force. And while I was in the military, I was the guy who would write love poems for other guys to send home to their girlfriends. I probably set up some marriages or something. I don't know, but guys would read my poetry and they would say, "Oh, man, how did you do that? How did you write that?" And I said, "Oh man, anybody can do that." And they would say, "No, man, anybody can't do that." So it took me a minute to realize that this was actually a gift that I had, or a talent of writing poetry. So I would write those poems for the guys to send home to the girlfriends. And I found out later on that Alex Haley, the guy who wrote Roots, he used to do the same thing when he was in the military. And I'm sure there's some other people that used to do it as well. But I thought that was pretty neat that I had something in common with somebody as famous as Alex Haley. I thought that was pretty cool. So after my career in the military, after that, I came back home and then came wife and kids. And I would always have these little sayings around the house that I would say, and also, with the kids, you read them their bedtime stories, and I would put their names in the stories to make it a little more interesting. That's what I like to do is put their names in the story and just make up little stuff, and eventually started taking some of that and turning it into books. And one of the sayings I had around the house was everything has its place. Everybody, people are always looking for stuff. At least in my house, they were. My wife, my kids, they're always looking for stuff. Where's my other shoe? Where's my other earring? And I would always tell them that if you put things back where they belong, you wouldn't have to look for them. I would always say everything has its place. So I wrote a poem called Everything Has Its Place. And I decided that I would take that poem and turn it into a children's book. So that was my first book. This Everything Has Its Place was my first book. And I didn't know anything about books. I just had one of my church members, so she was an artist, so I had her to draw some little pictures for me. She drew some little black and white pictures for me, and I took it to Kinko's. I took it to Kinko's and I actually had them to do some of the binding for me. And that was my first book. I knew absolutely nothing about ISBN numbers and barcodes and all of that stuff. I didn't know anything about all of that. And then a few years later, I wrote another poem. I wrote a poem called Different But the Same. And I got the idea, inspiration rather, from just being in the military. As a poet, as an author, a writer, you guys are familiar with this. You can get inspiration from anywhere. I can look at a billboard or I can hear a sermon at church, and all of a sudden, bam, there comes a poem. But this inspiration for this book came from my time in the military, just talking with guys and meeting them. The beauty of being in the military was that I got to meet people from all over the world and all over the country. And what I found out is when we sat down and talked to each other, even though we came from different places or we may have been different races, the bottom line is we're all the same. We watched the same TV shows when we were kids. We wore the same clothes. We played the same games. We even told the same lies to our parents. So the idea came to me that even though we're different, we're really all the same. And it's a book about, that teaches children that God loves us all, but we're different, but God loves us all the same. And that's where I got the idea from. So with that book, what I did was this is different but the same. It's actually my most popular book. I have 25 books now that I have self-published, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute too. 25 books, and I'm not going to share all of them with you today, but I've probably sold more of different but the same than I have all the others combined. And another great testimony with this little book here, I had no idea how to go from this, and I know you guys who are listening can't see this, but this is, I'm showing the picture of Everything Has Its Place, which is just a little black and white coloring book. I had no idea how to go from this to this, a professionally looking book. And this was something else that really blessed me along my journey. You never know who you're going to meet. I was at church one night. We were having a meeting about some things, and we were talking about, we had this little book called The Conversation Piece, and I was actually hosting the meeting. And the book called The Conversation Piece, it just asks little questions like, if you could go anywhere in the world, where would you like to go? Or if you could meet anybody, who would you like to meet? And one of the questions was, if you could be on any TV show, what show would you like to be on? And there was a young lady there. She said she would like to be on book TV. She didn't mention any game shows or any drama shows. She said she wanted to be on book TV because she loved authors. And I thought that was pretty cool. So after the session there, we were all sitting around talking, and I kind of pulled her to the side and I said, "Oh, wow, you'd like to be on book TV?" I said, "Well, I would like to write books." And she said, "Well, you need to meet my friend Vanessa Davis Griggs." So she told me about this lady named Vanessa Davis Griggs, who she writes novels, and she's a novelist. And I just admire novelists because they are just the pinnacle to me. Anybody who can sit down and write a novel, I think that is just so cool to come up with all of those words and stories the way they do. But anyway, she gave me Vanessa's number and I called her, And Vanessa met with me, didn't even know me, but she was willing to meet with me. She met with me and we sat down and we were talking. The first thing she said was, Cedric, if I show you how to do this, you are going to have to be serious about it because I show this and I give this information to so many people and they don't do anything with it. And I looked her in the eye and I said, Vanessa, if you show me how to do this, I promise you I'm going to do it. So after she showed me how to make my books a little more professional and taught me how to self-publish, I just went on from there. And another great testimony about this little book, my wife, I got to tell you about my wife, Miss Sharman Threatt. She's the best. She's my backbone. She's my biggest cheerleader. She's over there with all of her pom poms and everything. She was actually watching an episode of Oprah Winfrey one day, and the episode was about dads have dreams too. They talked about how men would set their dreams aside so they could take care of their family. And she came to me after the show and asked me what was my dream. And I told her that I wanted to have my book published because prior to that, I had actually sent my manuscript off to several publishers and I got so many rejection notices. I have a stack of rejection notices. So I just decided to self-publish it, but I didn't have the money. So what my wife did, I had a sample copy made at Kinko's again, and I just had one little copy made. And my wife, unbeknownst to me, she had taken that copy, and for my birthday, she made a cake. She had a cake made with the cover of the book on it. And she also had a t-shirt made with the cover of the book on it with a little slogan on the back. And then on top of that, she and my kids had gotten together and they put their money together and they made this big poster size check like you see on Publishers Clearinghouse. They made this check for me and it was enough money for me to make my first payment on getting my books self-published. So after that, man, I started running and I have been going ever since. So shout out to Vanessa Davis Griggs. Shout out to my wife, Miss Sharman Threatt. Shout out to everybody who has supported me along the way. Even with this podcast, shout out to you guys for supporting me in this because this is something that's been on my heart for a long time wanting to do. I just never really got out there and did it, but you know how at the beginning of the year, everybody makes these New Year's resolutions. Well, I didn't make a resolution. I call mine a declaration. You put away the Christmas decorations, and then you have what I call a declaration. You declare something. So I declared that this year I was going to be intentional. I was going to focus more on my writing and speaking, but I was also going to start a podcast. So here it is, America. Let's go get it. So then after I did my little book called Different But the Same, I started doing some other books. I actually wrote a little book. I don't have it with me now. It's a book called A Boy Called Short Rock, because Short Rock was my nickname when I was a kid. And I kind of did this book. I wrote it as kind of autobiographical, but it's not an autobiography because I actually just made some of the stuff up in the book, but some of it is true. I did that Boy Called Short Rock, and then I put together a book of poetry with some of my poems in them. And what I did, I decided to not just put the poems in the book so you would have poem after poem after poem. Sometimes how you would read a poem and you look at you read it and you think to yourself, I wonder what that person was thinking when they wrote that. So what I did was preceding each poem, I wrote a little paragraph that actually told the reader what I was thinking about before I wrote the poem, where I got the inspiration from. And that's how I did that. That book was called A Poet's Perspective. I did that one. I also did a book on the 50 states, teaching kids how to learn the 50 states. I call myself Cedric the Edutainer because I educate and entertain. I go out to schools and do presentations, puppet shows, and I like to have the kids having fun. They're having fun, but they're learning at the same time. That's why I am the edutainer. So this book about the 50 states, I thought it would be a neat way to teach kids how to learn the 50 states by making them all rhyme. I got all 50 states to rhyme, and that book is called A Journey Through the States with Harlow and Nate. And Harlow is a hamster from New Hampshire. So I just came up with all of this stuff, and I found an illustrator. Her name was Miss Angie Ingram. She illustrated the book for me, and even with different but the same, I found an illustrator named Miss Kelly. She did that one for me, and you know, the things were just lining up for me everywhere I was going on this journey, finding people to do what I couldn't, because I can't draw. I can't draw. That's the first question I get asked is, did I draw the pictures? And I tell people that I draw stick people and I draw them crooked. So I leave that to the people who actually know what they're doing. But I did that book, The Journey Through the States with Harlow and Nate. And then I just started doing some others. Here's one that I did called The No Bully Zone. Again, the inspiration came from me at being at one of the school visits. I saw a sign in the hall that said, "This school is a no bully zone." I went home and wrote a poem called The No Bully Zone. And this book is about a little boy named Billy who's the bully of his school and picks on everyone until he meets the new kid in the school, a little girl named Connie Confidence. And she teaches him that it's not nice to be a bully. So I did the No Bully Zone. And then I did a book called TJ's Big Discovery. This one was illustrated by one of my former classmates, a guy named Carlos George. Carlos was always drawing when we were in school. He was a great artist. So I asked him if he would illustrate this book for me. He did this one for me called TJ's Big Discovery. This is a book that encourages kids to read. It's a book about literacy because TJ is a little boy who can do everything well except read. And then he finds out later on in the book that his dad can't read. So it addresses the problem of childhood as well as adult illiteracy. So that was TJ's Big Discovery. I did that one. Here's a book called Jack and the Pirate Princess, which also addresses literacy because Jack is a fisherman, and he runs across this band of pirates who can do stuff like they want Jack to help them find a treasure. The only problem is they can't read a map. So this book addresses literacy too because the pirates can't read a map. Not only that, they can't read at all. So the premise of the book is Jack is explaining to them that once you learn to read, that's your treasure. Because every time you're holding a book, you're holding a treasure right there in your hand. So that's Jack and the Pirate Princess. I have another book here. This one was also illustrated by my friend Carlos George. It's called The Real Christmas Story. People always ask me, what's my favorite book? And I don't really have a favorite. That's like asking me which of my four kids is my favorite. I love them all equally. I don't have a favorite, but I do have a book that I'm most proud of, and it would be this one, The Real Christmas Story. And the reason I say I'm most proud of it is because of the way I did this book. Again, it's a poem that I wrote, but it's a poem like, the classic poem, The Night Before Christmas. Well, I took The Night Before Christmas and I rewrote it to tell the story of the birth of Jesus from the shepherd's point of view. And that's how I did that book. And I used to have a little DVD that would go along with it, had Christmas music in the background and everything. But that's the real Christmas story. And I'm really proud of that little book. Now, I kept writing and writing and writing and just doing all kinds of stuff with my writing. And in 2009, I had been working for a company here in Birmingham for 19 years. I was 2 months shy of having 20 years service at this company. I walked in the door on a Monday and they said, tomorrow's your last day. That's what they told me. I was losing my job. I bought my wife a brand new car. on a Tuesday, and the next Tuesday, I didn't have a job. So just like that, I was laid off. But you know what I did? I wrote a book about it. Wrote a book about it. Like, read it. Here it goes. This book is called Laid Off But Not Laid Out: How to Turn Your Setback into a Comeback. This was actually my first motivational book that I wrote. Laid off but not laid out. What I wanted to do with that book was tell my story, and I also interviewed some other people who had gone through the same thing I had gone through, and I tell their story in the book to inspire other people who may be going through stuff like that, because a layoff is pretty painful. It's a shock. It hits you right in the heart, but you can still make it. So that was my message with the laid off and not laid out. And now here's a book that I wrote on tithing. I am unapologetically a Christian, and I believe in tithing. But in a lot of instances, I believe that tithing is taught the wrong way. This book doesn't tell people that they should tithe. It doesn't tell them that they shouldn't tithe. It just gives the history of tithing, and it tells what it is and it isn't. You know how some people in churches, they may have a nice car or a big house, and they may have kind of a pompous attitude, like, I have all of this because I'm a tither. And then you have other people who maybe they're not tithers, and they're almost made to feel like they shouldn't even be in the church. And God doesn't want you to have either one of those attitudes, in my opinion. So that's why I wrote the book called The Ties That Bind. So that was another book that I did. And then I also, back to the children's book, here's a book on investing, Sylvester the Investor. I'm teaching kids to invest. So you see, I write books on all subjects. I don't have a certain niche that I write about. I just write about whatever comes to me. I start writing about it because I enjoy it. I really, really enjoy it. And that's why I'm so excited about this podcast, where I can get out here and talk to other like-minded people who share the same passion, so to speak, as I do. Here's a book that I did recently for teachers. I love teachers. This is called Because of You. I write about Miss Patrick in this book. Because of Miss Patrick, I'm writing these books. So I asked some of my former classmates and colleagues to write a paragraph or two about the one teacher that made an impact in their life. And I compiled those stories and I put them in that book called Because of You, because I want to inspire teachers. And that's what I'm doing now, is going out, speaking at schools and speaking at conferences to teachers to inspire them and to help them realize their why did they get in the teaching profession in the first place? Because teachers are the backbone of our community, and they deserve all our honor and respect and all the accolades we could give them. So that's why I wrote that book. And then I have one here called The Discussion. Remember when everybody was freaking out when Colin Kaepernick was kneeling for the national anthem? Well, that's what this book is about. This book talks about that, and it also talks about the murder of George Floyd. These two kids are discussing it in their social studies class. See, like I said, I write about all kinds of stuff. I got all kinds of stuff here. Here is my first book that I did for teenagers. This book was called Adolescence for Adolescents: 12 Lessons Every Teen Needs to Know. It talks about know who you are, be yourself, setting goals, things of that nature. There's a chapter on abstinence. There's a chapter on conflict resolution. There's even a chapter called Your Parents Are Not Your Friends, but they're not your enemies either. They're your parents. So that's what this book is all about for the teenagers. And then this book, I told you that the Laid Off But Not Laid Out was my first motivational book that I did. And my second motivational book is called The 7 Keys to Success. Everybody wants to know how to be a success. Everybody wants to know the secret to success. Well, I have the secret sauce. I've got the secret to success. I put it in this book. And I actually did two versions. This is the secular version, and this is the scriptural version. You know, the word success has 7 letters. Each letter represents a key. That's why it's called the 7 keys to success. And that's my book there. Also have a book here called The Bumpkins, about some little bears growing up in the country. That's one of my latest children's books. Here's my book called Black Like Me. This book encourages kids to celebrate people in their own community. You know, Black History Month is in February, and that's great. And we celebrate all the famous people then. We should celebrate people year round. And that's what Black Like Me does. I could take you to any community and show you Black people who are doing great things. And that's what these kids need to realize. And that's why I wrote Black Like Me. Along the lines of the no bully zone, here is the bully-proof vest. You know, the police officers have what they call their bullet-proof vest, which stops bullets from penetrating. Well, when you're wearing the bully-proof vest, it stops words from penetrating. Whenever bullies come around with all of these insults and hurling all of this stuff at you, their words just bounce right off because you're wearing your bully-proof vest. Then I have a book here called Tuffy the Incredible Puppy. I just released this book in January of this year. Tuffy the Incredible Puppy. Tuffy is a little dog that was adopted from an animal shelter. He's kind of special. You'll have to read Tuffy. He's got another secret in that book as well. And then along the lines of teenagers again, this is a proof copy of my book called Suit Yourself. This is my latest book. This is my 25th book. This book right here, it just lets teenagers know that life is choice driven. The choices you make today will determine the suit you'll wear tomorrow. That's why it's called Suit Yourself. And then finally, I saved this one for last. I actually have a book about how to write a book. Because people are always asking me, how do you do this? And that's what we're going to be learning and discussing in this podcast as well. But people want to know how to do it. So I wrote a book called The Right Stuff. I used to do workshops and seminars where I would teach people the stuff that I'd learned on how to write a book, the stuff that Vanessa Davis Griggs taught me and some other people, and things that I learned along my journey. I used to do workshops and seminars, so I decided to just compile all of that information and put it in a book called The Right Stuff. And that book is also available. So those are my credentials. That's where I'm coming from. That's why I want to do this, because I want everybody who is interested, everybody who wants to do this, I want to show them how to do it. I want to inspire them. I want them to know that it can be done. Because like I said earlier, I had a stack of rejection notices this thick. And I would still like to be published from a mainstream publisher. That's great. If that happens, great. But if not, I decided I just wasn't going to sit around and wait on them. I was going to get out and do this thing myself. So I learned how to do it, and I'm teaching others to do the same. So we're going to be talking about both parts of it, though. We're going to be talking about how to pursue a mainstream publisher, if that's what you want to do. But we're also going to show you how to do this thing on your own, because I believe everybody has a story. I meet people all the time, and they say, well, I can't write. Yes, you can. Because I tell people, if you can talk, you can write. It's as simple as that. It's just as simple as putting it down, because the world needs to hear your story. And that's what I want to help you do. That's what these other authors and speakers are going to be helping you do on this podcast. So thanks again for tuning in to the Well Said podcast. Remember to hit that like and subscribe button. Tell all your friends about it, because this is going to be great. This is going to be awesome. I am so excited. And as always, I want you to keep being great. Why? Because somebody's got to be great today. It might as well be you. Take care.